Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I don't talk about this much in real life, mostly because I still don't really know how to explain it without sounding dramatic. But enough time has passed that it feels like something I can finally put into words. A few years ago, my wife and I moved our family out to a little town in the Appalachians, one of those quiet valleys in southern West Virginia where the hills close in around you like cupped hands and everyone at the gas station seems to know each other's business. We'd been living in a cramped two-bedroom place outside of Columbus with 3 kids and a dog, and it felt like the walls were slowly inching inward with every new toy, every baby gate, every load of laundry. When my company announced a position that let me work mostly remote and only drive into an office in Charleston once or twice a week, it felt like a lifeline. We found the house on a listing site at 2 a.m, old, a little beat up, but sitting on a cheap piece of land backed right up against the woods, ridgeline visible over the treetops. It had this good bones charm that my wife Nora kept insisting was worth the peeling paint and the weird layout. The neighbors we met during that first week all smiled the same easy mountain smile and told us things like, "You can leave your doors unlocked around here," and "It's the kind of place where nothing really happens," which sounded nice, even if it felt too good to be true. The thing that sold Nora, though, was the backyard. It wasn't big in the typical suburban sense, but it stretched back further than it looked at first, tapering off into the tree line. Someone at some point had cared about the garden. You could see it in the stone pathways swallowed halfway by grass, the terraced beds edged with old bricks, and the odd collection of weather-stained statues scattered around like forgotten centuries. They weren't the cute kind you find at home improvement stores either. These were taller, maybe 4 feet high, rough-featured angels and robed figures, and one that might have been a shepherd, all carved from some kind of pale stone that had darkened in streaks over time. Their faces were worn and indistinct, eyes sunken almost flat, which somehow made them more unsettling. Nora loved them immediately. Said they gave the yard character, like Wed inherited some strange folk art gallery. I didn't feel strongly one way or another. I grew up in flat suburbia, and the combination of woods and old stone figures over my shoulder just felt different. But I had more immediate worries, like stretching my new salary to cover a mortgage and praying the company didn't suddenly decide remote wasn't working out. So I let the statues be. We were still surrounded by moving boxes that first week, living off paper plates and frozen pizza. The kind of tired where you forget what day it is. One afternoon, I was standing by the back window with a lukewarm coffee, just zoning out, when something about the yard made me blink and really look. One of the statues, the angel, I think, though the face was too worn to be sure, was turned slightly away from the house, shoulders angled toward the woods. It didn't immediately register as wrong, just off. Every time Id glanced out before, I could have sworn all of them were facing inward, like their blank eyes were turned toward the house and whoever was standing where I was. Now this one's back was almost to me, as if it was listening to something in the trees. I chalked it up to my own lousy memory. Wed just moved. I'd seen them in passing while juggling furniture and kids. It wasn't like I'd taken an inventory. I let it go. The next morning, I was standing in the same spot, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, and my eyes went to the statues automatically. That's when my stomach did a little drop. Another one had turned. The shepherd-looking one now stood with its back half turned toward the house as well, like it had shifted during the night to join the angel. I'm not talking about a tiny difference in angle that you could argue about later. These things were clearly oriented a different way than I remembered. This time, I didn't brush it off so quickly. I went outside, the cold grass soaking through my socks because I hadn't bothered with shoes, and stood right in front of them. The stone was wet cold under my fingers when I touched the edge of the angel's robe. There were no obvious tracks in the soil around them, but the ground was a mix of old mulch and packed earth, not exactly a footprint-friendly surface. Up close, I could see faint tool marks in the stone, like whoever carved them had worked fast or without much skill. The longer I stared, the more ridiculous I felt. Heavy, ugly statues in the yard, new house nerves, end of story. By the time I went back inside, I'd decided I was overthinking it. Still, after breakfast, I casually asked Nora if she remembered which way the statues had been facing. She shrugged, wiped a smear of jelly off our toddler's face, and said she thought they'd always been the same. Our oldest, Eli, overheard and asked what statues we were talking about. And when I explained, he gave me this weird little grin, like he thought I was making up a ghost story. I laughed it off, but a part of me was already uneasy. Money was tight. My job felt like it was hanging by a thread. And now, apparently, I was obsessing over landscaping. A few days went by without anything strange happening, and I stopped checking the backyard every time I walked through the living room. The house started to feel more like ours. The kids finally remembered which doorway led to which room. We learned the sound of the train that passed through town late at night, and the particular way the wind slid through the trees behind the house, making it sound like the woods were breathing. Then one evening, I glanced out the back window on my way to turn off a light, and the image I saw rooted me to the floor in this cold, electric way I'll never forget. All of the statues were lined up in a straight row along the back wall of the house. There were 5 of them in total, and every single one now stood only a few feet from the siding, arranged shoulder to shoulder like they were on silent watch. Each one faced directly toward the windows. Blank, eroded faces aimed straight at the house. At us. They hadn't been like that earlier. I knew it with the kind of certainty you feel in your bones. For a long second, I just stared, my mind refusing to accept the logistics of what I was seeing. Those statues had to weigh a couple 100 pounds each. No way Eli, who was 8 and skinny as a rake, had dragged them around while I wasn't looking. No way they'd shifted on their own unless the earth had opened up and spun them like chess pieces. The hair on my arms stood up. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I did a quick scan of the yard from inside, looking for any movement, any sign that someone was out there. But everything was still. The woods loomed dark and dense beyond the fence line, and somewhere far off, a dog barked, then stopped. Eventually, I forced myself to go outside. I stepped onto the back deck and just stood for a moment, listening. You know that particular silence where you're so alert that even your own breathing sounds too loud? That's what it felt like. I walked up to the closest statue and tried to lift it, just to prove to myself that this was possible, that there was some mundane explanation involving teenagers and way too much free time. I wrapped my arms around the cold stone torso and heaved. It didn't even rock. Maybe I shifted it an inch at most, and even that felt like I was going to throw out my back. I backed away, my hands tingling. Whoever had done this wasn't just messing with us. They were strong, or there had been more than one of them. As that thought sank in, I noticed something else, something that made my stomach twist. The statue at the far right of the row had something resting in its hands, balanced in the shallow bowl of its stone palms. It was blue and plastic, and stupidly familiar. One of Eli's toy trucks. I knew for a fact that truck had been upstairs in his room earlier that day. He'd stepped on it next to his bed. My first instinct was denial. I told myself he must have brought it outside and left it somewhere, but the way it had been placed, centered perfectly in those cupped hands, felt deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl. Someone had been inside our house. They'd gone into my kid's room, taken one of his toys, and arranged this little scene in our yard like it was a joke. By then, Nora had come out onto the deck behind me. She followed my gaze, saw the truck, saw the row of statues, and I watched the color drain from her face. Her first guess was that maybe some local kids were hazing the new family on the block. And on paper, that sounded halfway rational. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt off. Harmless pranks didn't usually involve entering someone's home and creeping around upstairs while the whole family slept. We called the sheriff's office. The deputy who showed up was polite, but clearly skeptical. He walked the yard with a flashlight, asked the usual questions, any exes, angry co-workers, family feuds, and suggested we think about installing cameras. I nodded like I would, but in the back of my mind, I was counting the balance in our checking account and silently calculating which bill would go unpaid if we did. After he left, the house felt different. The shadows in the corners seemed heavier. I found myself double-checking the locks every night, even though everyone around here swore it was safe enough to leave doors wide open. Days passed. Nothing else happened. We tried not to talk about the statues in front of the kids, tried to act normal, but I started noticing how often Nora would pause at a window and peek through the curtain, how she jumped at little noises from the deck. I told myself that whoever had done it had gotten bored or spooked by the visit from law enforcement and moved on. That illusion lasted until the next weekend. It was a Saturday. I remember because the kids were in the living room in pajamas, watching cartoons after breakfast while the dogs snored on the rug. The air outside had that damp chill that clings to Appalachian valleys in early spring. I slid open the back door to let the dog out and immediately saw it. Big block letters sprayed across the rear wall of our house in dripping black paint, just above where the statues had stood. Go away. No hearts, no tags, no smiley faces. Just those two words, painted with enough pressure that the paint had run in rivulets down the siding. For a second, I forgot I was holding the door open, and our youngest, Sam, almost toddled past my leg toward the steps. I scooped him up so quickly he let out a startled cry. My brain went white-hot with anger. I shoved the kids back inside, told Nora to stay with him, and then I did something that doesn't really fit with the person I think of myself as. I stormed down off the deck and into the yard, yelling into the trees, voice cracking, threatening a faceless you who was almost certainly nowhere nearby. There's a particular kind of rage that comes from feeling like someone is playing with your family's safety, and it hit me fast and ugly. I walked the entire property line, pushing through thorny brush at the back fence, checking the gaps between boards, scanning for movement in the undergrowth. All I found were old beer cans and a raccoon trail leading down toward the creek. As that adrenaline drained away, it was replaced by a cold, settling fear. This wasn't some silly prank. Somebody wanted us gone badly enough to creep around our house at night with spray paint. Badly enough to sneak into our home and take a toy out of my kid's room. We called the sheriff again. Another report. Another gentle suggestion about cameras. Another vague promise about increased patrols. The deputy's tone this time was a little different, less amused, more concerned, but the end result was the same. They couldn't sit outside our house all night on a vague threat and some vandalism. That night, after Wed scrubbed at the paint until our arms ached and the words still ghosted through in a gray shadow, I stood at the kitchen sink in the dark, staring out at the yard. Without the porch light, the statues were just darker shapes against a dark background, and the woods behind them were a black wall. Somewhere out there, a whippoorwill called the same three notes over and over. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath, listening for something else. That's when I heard it. A low, tuneless whistling drifting from the direction of the trees, just barely audible over the sound of the refrigerator motor. It wasn't the wind. It rose and fell in a jagged pattern, as if someone who didn't quite remember the melody of a song was trying to hum it anyway. My fingers tightened around the edge of the countertop. The whistling went on for maybe 30 seconds, and then stopped abruptly, like whoever was making it realized they'd been heard. I snapped on the porch light and stepped out, heart pounding. The yard was empty. The statues were where Wed last left them. The woods just watched. I didn't tell Nora about the whistling that night. I wish I had. But part of me was still clinging to the idea that I might be imagining things, that the stress and lack of sleep were making me hear patterns in normal sounds. Besides, she already looked like she was one bad night away from packing everyone into the car and just driving until the road ran out. I didn't want to push her there yet. We made it through a couple more days without incident. The kids adapted faster than we did. They were more interested in exploring the creek behind the house and catching salamanders than in the weird way their parents kept peeking out windows. For the first time since the graffiti, I started to think maybe the whole thing had burned itself out. Then came the night with the masks. It was a little after 9. The younger two were asleep, Eli was in his room with a book, and Nora and I were in the living room half watching some forgettable show. I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water, and that's when I heard her scream. It wasn't a startled yelp. It was a full-throated, primal sound that made my blood ice over. I sprinted back in and found her standing rigid by the sliding glass door, one hand over her mouth, the other pointing out into the yard. I followed her gaze and felt something inside me detach, like my mind needed a second to catch up to my eyes. There were 5 people in our backyard, standing right where the statues had been. They were all wearing white face coverings, plain, featureless masks that caught the porch light and erased any sense of identity. They weren't just standing still either. They were moving in this jerky, synchronized way, arms lifting and dropping, legs bending, torsos twisting as if they were being operated by separate, unskilled puppeteers. It wasn't a dance you'd learn off TikTok or see at a football game. It was awkward, repetitive, wrong. The fact that they were completely silent made it 10 times worse. I remember thinking, in a weird, detached way, that they had taken the place of the statues, as if the stone figures had stepped aside and let living bodies borrow their positions. For a few long seconds, Nora and I didn't move. I'm not sure I even blinked. The only sound in the room was the frantic ticking of the cheap wall clock. My brain flipped through options like flashcards and came up empty. Fight or flight is a real thing. But there's this third option they don't talk about as much. Freeze. That's where I was. Finally, something in me snapped back into motion. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we owned from the block on the counter. My voice came out louder and more high-pitched than I intended when I told Nora to call the sheriff. She snatched up her phone with shaking hands while I yanked open the door and stepped out onto the deck, yelling something I don't even fully remember. The 5 figures stopped their strange movements and turned their masked faces toward me in unison. The sudden precision of it sent a jolt of pure animal fear through me. I took one step toward them, knife in hand, adrenaline roaring in my ears, and then the rational part of my brain finally cut through. There were 5 of them and 1 of me. I had no idea if they were armed, how old they were, how desperate. I took 2 steps back instead, retreating to the doorway, torn between wanting to keep them in sight and wanting to slam the door shut and deadbolted so many times the metal bent. Without a word, the figures broke and ran, disappearing toward the back fence and the trees beyond in a flurry of dark clothes and pale masks. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it replayed in my head on a loop for months afterward. The deputies showed up again. Lights sweeping the yard, boots crunching on gravel and dead leaves as they searched the property and the tree line. No masks. No fresh footprints they could distinguish from the mess already there. No empty spray cans or discarded knives or anything they could bag and tag as evidence. Just 5 sets of impressions in the grass where someone had been standing, and even those looked like they could have been made by anyone. That was it for me. Whatever mental equation I'd been running that balanced moving costs against mortgage payments and job security suddenly felt irrelevant. I bought a basic camera system the next morning with a credit card I probably shouldn't have used. I spent the day on a ladder running wires, drilling into siding, sweating through my shirt even though the air was cool. I added extra locks to the doors, screwed a bar into the frame above the sliding glass door so it couldn't be forced open from the outside. The house started to feel less like a home and more like a fort. That night, as I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen, scrolling through the live feeds from the backyard cameras on my phone, I noticed a tiny blinking red indicator on one of the clips. Motion detected. I tapped it open. The timestamp was 3:12 a.m., the time when the valley is dead quiet, when even the trains seem to hold their breath. The clip was short, just a few seconds long. At first, all I could see was static, dark shapes, pixelated shadows that might have been branches swaying. Then a pale oval filled the frame as something moved in close, so close that the cheap lens couldn't focus properly. It took my mind half a second to process that I was looking at a mask. One of those same white coverings, inches from the camera, tilted slightly as if whoever wore it was studying the device, considering it. There were no eye holes visible, just a smooth, blank surface. Then the clip ended. No retreat, no figure walking away, just a jump back to the empty yard. I sat there staring at my phone so long, the screen dimmed. I didn't show that footage to Nora. Maybe I was trying to protect her, or maybe I was trying to protect myself from seeing the fear in her face that I already felt in my own. I sent the clip to the sheriff's office, who thanked me and added it to the file. We never heard much more after that. The camera stayed up. The statue stayed clustered near the back fence where Id dragged them with the deputy's help one afternoon, wanting them as far from the house as possible. The graffiti faded under layers of primer and new paint. No more masks, no more whistling, no more toys appearing where they shouldn't be. Life, in that stubborn, mundane way it has, went on. The kids started school. Nora made friends with a woman from church who brought over casseroles and listened without prying too hard. I learned my way around the mountain roads well enough to drive them half asleep. On the surface, everything calmed down. But the scariest part to me isn't any single moment, the statues lined up, the message on the wall, the masked figures in the yard. It's the fact that we never got an answer. No arrests, no dramatic confession from some local kid, no neighbor admitting it was a joke that got out of hand. Just a series of events that stopped as suddenly as they started. We still live in that house. I still lock the doors in a town where most people don't. I still catch myself pausing at the back window some nights, listening for a fragment of tuneless whistling under the sound of the wind in the trees. Maybe whoever did it moved on. Maybe the cameras spooked them. Maybe they just got bored. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that for a stretch of time in our lives, I felt like we were sharing our home with someone we couldn't see. Someone who knew the layout of our rooms and the weight of our doors. Someone who stood in our yard and stared at our windows like they were watching a show. And that feeling, that awareness of being watched in a place that's supposed to be the safest spot in your world stuck with me in a way I can't fully shake. If you've ever had a neighbor, a stranger, or a house that made you feel like that, like you weren't alone even when you should have been, tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how many of us have stories we keep to ourselves because they sound too strange until someone else says, "Yeah, that happened to me too." Story 2. When I think back on that house in the Appalachian Mountains, there's this one memory that rises above all the others, like a knot in a piece of wood you can't sand smooth no matter how long you work at it. A year before all of this happened, my wife Jenna and I had decided we were done living on top of people. We'd been renting a cramped duplex outside Pittsburgh, listening to our upstairs neighbors stomp around at midnight and arguing about street parking more often than I care to admit. I work as a maintenance tech for a regional hospital chain, the kind of job that follows you anywhere as long as there are buildings that break, and Jenna had already stepped back from full-time work years earlier because of her health. So we pulled the trigger when we found a place tucked halfway up a hillside in southeastern Kentucky, just outside a small town where the main street had more empty storefronts than open ones, and the ridgelines wrapped around the valley like folded arms. The house itself was bigger than we needed, 3 bedrooms, a finished attic, and a long, low-slung shape that hugged the slope of the hill. It came with a basement that the listing photos barely showed, just a concrete wall and a glimpse of some old shelves, but I didn't think much of it. The price was low enough that I kept waiting for someone to email us and say it had been a typo. Boone, our old hound mix, took to the place immediately. Nose buried in the leaf litter, tail wagging like head finally found where he was supposed to be. We signed papers, shook hands with the realtor, and tried to convince ourselves we weren't making a huge mistake. For a while, it felt like we weren't. The first few months were a blur of unpacked boxes, new routines, learning which winding mountain road actually got us to the grocery store without adding 40 minutes. I spent most of my time upstairs or out in the yard, patching gutters and fixing little things the inspection had glossed over. The basement might as well not have existed. It was out of sight, out of mind, a dark, cluttered space under our feet that we only thought about when we tossed something down there for later. The first strange thing started as something completely mundane. The lights upstairs kept tripping the breaker. It was always the same circuits, our bedroom, and the small room we used as an office. The rest of the house would stay on, but those rooms would go black without warning. As annoying as it was, I wasn't worried. Electrical work is part of what I do for a living, and I'm used to dealing with badly wired buildings. I figured the load was just distributed poorly and it'd sort it out one weekend. One afternoon after work, daylight still clinging to the hills outside, I finally decided to deal with it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the narrow basement stairs. The air changed with each step, going from warm and dry to cool and damp, with that faint mineral smell you only get in old foundations. The realtor hadn't exaggerated when she called it storage ready. It was a jumble of old furniture, rotting cardboard boxes, rusted tools, and who knows what else the previous owners had never bothered to haul away. I picked my way through it, the flashlight beam bouncing off the concrete walls, until I found the main breaker panel on the far side. It took maybe 10 minutes to trace the problem and figure out how I'd need to redistribute the load. I was about to head back upstairs and make a mental note to pick up supplies when my flashlight caught something in the corner, behind a leaning stack of cracked plastic totes. It was a door, but not like any interior door I'd expect to see in a house like this. It was metal, set directly into the concrete wall, taller and wider than standard, with heavy hinges and a thick handle that looked like it belonged on a walk-in refrigerator or a secure storage room. The concrete around the frame was rough, like it had been cut out and patched back in a hurry. There was a keyhole set beneath the handle, ringed with scratches. I'd walked through this basement once with the realtor when we first saw the place, but I hadn't noticed the door then. I told myself it had just blended into the clutter and darkness, but there was something about it that made me feel like I was looking at a part of the house I wasn't supposed to see. I tried the handle. It didn't move at all. It felt solid, like the door weighed a few hundred pounds, and whatever was locking it was not interested in budging. That alone would have been enough to stick in my mind. But there was another detail that made my skin prickle. At about eye level, someone had drawn a small, crude eye in black marker on the metal, just a circle with lashes and a dot in the center. The ink faded, but still clearly visible. I stood there a moment, flashlight beam lingering on that little drawing, then shook it off and went upstairs, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Over the next few days, the locked door kept popping into my thoughts at odd moments while I was brushing my teeth, waiting on hold with the power company, weeding the small garden behind the house. It wasn't like I hadn't seen weird leftover features in old buildings before. Storm shelters, root cellars, even a panic room once in a wealthy patient's house. But none of those had been in the place I slept. Finally, curiosity won. The previous owners, an older couple named the Crawfords, had left us a heavy ring of keys in a kitchen drawer, along with a handwritten note that said, "For locks and such." One evening, I dumped them onto the table and marched back down to the basement, Boone's nails clicking on the steps behind me until he reached a point where he just stopped and whined, refusing to go farther. I tried the keys one by one, the metal clinking in the silence. None of them fit. A few slid in partway and stuck before I yanked them back out. By the time I'd worked through every key on the ring, there was a cold knot in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature down there. Whoever had locked that door had taken the key with them or kept it close. Later that week, Jenna managed to track down a number for the Crawfords. She's better at those things than I am. She can make strangers feel like old friends in under 5 minutes. That night, we sat at the kitchen table with the phone on speaker, Boone snoring under my feet. Mr. Crawford sounded polite but oddly distant, his wife chiming in now and then in a thin, tight voice. When I brought up the door, there was a pause long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then, Mrs. Crawford said it was just a storm room that had put in after a bad tornado season years back, but they'd lost the key and hadn't used it in a long time. She told us to ignore it. Her tone wasn't reassuring. It was careful, like she was stepping around a hole in the floor she knew was there but didn't want to admit. We hung up soon after, both of us staring at the phone like it might offer a better explanation if we waited long enough. For a while, I tried to let it go. Life has a way of stacking more immediate worries in front of you. Jenna's, doctor appointments, a leak in the roof after a heavy rain, a scare at work when rumors floated that they might outsource part of our department. But every so often, I'd find myself at the top of the basement stairs, hand on the rail, wondering if I should go back down and try again. The first small thing that pushed me over the edge wasn't dramatic. It was a leftover sandwich. Wed had a late dinner one night, grilled cheese and tomato soup. I wrapped half a sandwich and left it in the fridge on a plate, planning to eat it for lunch the next day. When I opened the fridge that afternoon, the plate was there, the plastic wrap folded back neatly, and the sandwich was gone. No crumbs, no grease, nothing. I assumed Jenna had eaten it and asked her about it later. She frowned, thought about it, and said she hadn't touched it. It was such a stupidly small thing that I laughed it off and forgot about it. But looking back now, that was the first time the house reached out and tapped me on the shoulder. The second time, it didn't tap so gently. I woke up around 3 in the morning a few days later to the sound of Boone growling low in his throat. His ears were up, his whole body tense at the foot of the bed, eyes fixed on the hallway. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. At first I thought he'd dreamed it, but then I heard it again. A faint, dragging sound somewhere below us, like something heavy being pulled slowly across concrete. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of that hour it might as well have been a siren. I lay there holding my breath, trying to tell myself it was pipes or the furnace or some other house noise I hadn't learned yet. The sound came again. A little shorter this time, then stopped for good. I got up and checked the locks on the exterior doors, every window I could reach. All closed, all latched. I didn't go down to the basement. I told myself I'd just be feeding my imagination. The next morning, I called a locksmith. Jenna had been against messing with the door at first, saying the whole thing gave her a bad feeling. But after I told her about the dragging sound, careful to keep my voice as calm as possible, she agreed it was time to know. The locksmith, a wiry guy in his 50s from the next county over, didn't seem fazed when I showed him the door. He whistled low and said it was overkill for a storm room, but set to work without asking many questions. I went back upstairs after a while, pacing the kitchen, listening for any sign had gotten through. About half an hour later, he came up, shaking his head slightly. Said whoever installed that lock hadn't wanted anyone getting in without serious effort, but he thought he could crack it if we were okay with the possibility of having to replace the whole mechanism. I told him to do what he needed to do. Another half hour passed. When he finally called up that he had it, my stomach dropped. The air in the basement felt colder than usual as I descended. He was standing off to the side, arms folded, his expression carefully neutral in the way people's faces get when they've seen something but aren't sure whether to comment. The door stood slightly ajar, a strip of darkness visible beyond it. He said he'd leave us to it, mentioned payment, and I pressed cash into his hand almost absent-mindedly. My focus narrowed to that opening. When Jenna and I stepped inside, our footsteps echoed more than I expected. The room was bigger than I'd imagined. Maybe 12 by 16 feet, with unpainted concrete walls and a low, smooth ceiling. A single, bare bulb hung from a wire in the center, but it had been unscrewed just enough that it didn't come on when I flipped the switch by the door. I had my flashlight, though, and the beam cut a white arc through the dim, catching the details that would keep me awake for months. Calling it a storm room was almost funny. There were no emergency supplies, no water jugs, no shelves of canned food or first aid kits. Instead, one wall was covered in photographs, dozens of old black and white and color prints tacked directly into the concrete with small nails. Faces stared out from them. Strangers, family groups, a man leaning against a truck, kids on bikes, a woman sitting on a porch. At first I thought they were just random old photos, maybe a collection someone had started decades ago. Then my light caught a more recent cluster and my breath hitched. There were pictures of our house, not the way it looked in the listing photos, but how it looked now. The most recent images showed our car in the driveway, Boone in the yard, Jenna on the porch with her back turned. One photo, slightly crooked, showed me through the kitchen window, head bent as I rinsed dishes at the sink. My hand shook so hard the beam bounced across the wall, distorting faces into ghostly streaks. Someone had been taking pictures of us, printing them, and pinning them up down here like keepsakes. Next to the photos, etched into the concrete in small, careful lines, were dates. Dozens of them, stretching back years. Some had simple words next to them like rain or snow. Others had initials I didn't recognize. There were new dates, too, ones from after Wed moved in. 2 of them had our initials scrawled beside them in a cramped hand, along with single words that made my mouth go dry. Arrived, and beneath it, on a later date, staying. On the opposite wall, a narrow cot sat pushed into the corner, blankets crumpled on top, the fabric stained and smelling faintly of sweat and mildew. An old metal chair faced the wall of photographs, positioned just so, as if whoever used it had spent long stretches of time just sitting there and staring. At the foot of the cot, in a dented metal trash can, were empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles, and, disturbingly, a few prescription pill bottles with the labels peeled off. The realization hit me all at once. Someone hadn't just used this room years ago and abandoned it. Someone had been living here recently, long enough to settle in, to make this space feel like theirs, and they'd been here while we were living upstairs. As that thought rolled over me, I noticed another detail that might have been easy to miss in the chaos. High on the wall, opposite the door, half hidden behind the photographs, was a rectangular metal vent, a small, horizontal opening covered by a simple grate. It looked like any other ventilation duct until I stepped closer and shined the light through it. I could see a glimpse of drywall, a stud, and then what looked like the backside of another vent cover. I did a quick mental map of the house's layout and felt my stomach lurch. The vent in this wall lined up almost perfectly with the one high on the wall in our bedroom where Wed joked that the house breathed. Someone lying on that cot could stand on the chair, put their face to the vent, and hear every word we said while we were in bed. They could listen to our arguments, our late-night whispers, the sound of Boone's collar jingling as he hopped up and down. I don't know how long we stood there, Jenna's fingers gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. Eventually, we backed out, and I pulled the heavy door shut more out of instinct than logic, as if I could push everything I'd just seen back into the dark and lock it away again. We talked to the sheriff that afternoon. They sent a couple of deputies who took pictures, asked questions, and promised to try to contact the Crawfords formally. One deputy walked around the outside of the house and came back to tell us what had been too rattled to register. There was a secondary entrance to that room. A low, rusted metal hatch was set into the hill behind the house, half obscured by briars and fallen branches. It was the kind of thing you might overlook unless you were specifically looking for it. The hatch led to a set of narrow concrete steps that opened into the far side of the room, tucked behind the cot. It meant whoever had been staying there hadn't needed to enter through our house at all. They could slip out through the hillside in the middle of the night and be gone into the trees in seconds. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. The rest of that day passed in a haze. I remember locking the basement door from the main floor, as if that was any real protection. I remember the look on Jenna's face as she stood at the kitchen window, eyes unfocused, her hand resting on Boone's head like she needed to feel something solid and warm. When night finally came, neither of us was even close to sleep. We lay in bed, fully dressed, the lamp on, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old house, jumping at every flicker of headlight on the ceiling from a car passing on the road far below. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off despite myself. I woke to a sound I felt more than heard, a dull, booming impact against the front door that rattled the frame. Boone exploded into barking, a deep, panicked sound that echoed down the hallway. The second hit came a moment later, like someone throwing their weight into the wood. I sat up, heart pounding so hard it hurt, and listened. Another hit, then silence. I crept to the bedroom window that faced the front of the house and eased the curtain back a fraction of an inch. The porch light cast a weak cone over the steps and the gravel pull-off, but I couldn't see anyone. For a moment I wondered if some branch or debris had blown against the door, but there was no wind, the trees standing dead still in the moonlight. Before I could decide whether to call the sheriff, another sound started. This time from the back of the house, a soft pattering against the glass of our living room windows, irregular but persistent, like someone throwing small stones or gravel one by one. The sound was too intentional to be anything else. I grabbed the bat I keep under the bed and made it to the end of the hallway before I stopped. The living room was lit by the blue glow of the TV Wed left on low. As I peered around the corner, another small rock hit the window and bounced off into the darkness. I edged closer until I could see the backyard. There was movement at the tree line, shifting shadows that might have been one person or several, impossible to tell at that distance. They stayed just far enough back that the porch light couldn't reach them. The patter of rocks went on for another 10, maybe 15 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Part of me wanted to fling the door open and charge out there, bat in hand, but a larger, colder part did the math. We were alone on that hillside. The nearest neighbor a good stretch of road away, the sheriff's department 20 minutes out on a good night. Every instinct I had told me that opening any door right then would be the worst thing I could do. I backed away, locked every deadbolt again even though they were already locked, and called the sheriff with shaking fingers. They sent a car, but by the time the deputies arrived, whoever had been out there was gone. They found a few small rocks in the grass. Nothing that couldn't have been there for months. No fresh footprints, no cigarette butts, nothing they could hold up as proof that we weren't just jumpy city transplants with overactive imaginations. That might have been the end of it if not for what happened the following night. The sheriff had promised to do extra patrols in our area for a while, and I clung to that as a reason to stay, to not pack everything and run. I spent the next day in a kind of exhausted fog, going through the motions at work while my mind replayed the sounds of the previous night. When I got home, Jenna told me she'd heard from our realtor. She was apologetic. Said she'd had no idea about the extra room. Insisted that the Crawfords had never mentioned anyone staying on the property aside from a grandson who visited sometimes years ago. It didn't make me feel better, but at least I knew she was as blindsided as we were. That night, we slept with the bedroom window cracked just enough to hear if anyone approached the house. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke. Sometime after 2, I woke to a different kind of sound. The brittle, crystalline snap of glass breaking downstairs. This time there was no question of what it was. I was on my feet before my brain had fully caught up, bat in hand, Boone barking ahead of me as I bolted down the hallway. In the kitchen, the scene looked surreal. The small window above the sink had been shattered inward, shards scattered across the counter and floor, glinting in the faint light from the microwave clock. The night beyond was empty. As I reached the doorway, I caught a glimpse of movement through the broken frame, 2 dark shapes sprinting away across the yard, heading toward the slope of the hill and the tree line beyond. They moved fast, sure-footed even in the uneven ground, disappearing into the darkness in seconds. I didn't chase them. Every bit of training, every safety briefing I'd ever sat through at work, came roaring back into my head. Do not pursue. I stood there, breathing hard, bat clenched in my hands, my bare feet an inch from the glass. Jenna called the sheriff, her voice trembling. They came out again, more serious this time. Flashlights sweeping the yard, radios crackling. One deputy checked the storm room door and the exterior hatch. Both were shut. The new padlock it added still in place. Whoever had been staying down there, if it was the same person, had been locked out, and they weren't handling it well. The deputies took more statements, reassured us they'd increase patrols, and gently suggested that if we had family we could stay with for a few nights, we might want to consider it. We didn't. Our nearest relatives were hours away, and Jenna's health made that kind of disruption more complicated than it sounded. So we stayed, because what else were we supposed to do? Over the next week, the sheriff's office managed to get informal contact with the Crawfords. We weren't privy to those conversations, but I heard enough to know they were cooperating. Rumors travel fast in small towns, and I caught fragments at the gas station and the hardware store. Someone mentioned a troubled nephew Hode bounced in and out of rehab. Another talked about that boy who never could quite live on his own. No one said the words out loud, but the implication was clear. They suspected someone the Crawfords knew had been using that room as a place to disappear, and when we moved in, he hadn't been ready to give it up. The patrol car did swing by more often. The broken window got replaced. I added a second lock to the front door and screwed a length of board into the frame so the back door couldn't be forced open more than a few inches from the outside. At some point, the dragging noise at night stopped. Boone slept more. The house, at least on the surface, settled. But that room is still there. The photos came down, boxed and turned over to the sheriff's office, but the holes in the concrete remain. The dates, etched into the wall, aren't going anywhere. The cot is gone, the trash cleaned out. But every time I walk past that heavy metal door, I picture someone standing on that chair, their ear pressed to the shared vent between our walls, listening to us talk about bills and doctor appointments and whether we should paint the living room, listening to us worry about them without knowing who they were. It's been a while now, and we're still in the house. for better or worse. Some mornings when the fog hangs low over the valley and the sun's just starting to hit the ridge, it almost feels like what we imagined when we first moved here. Quiet, peaceful, a fresh start. Other nights, when the wind shifts and makes the siding creak just right, I lie awake and think about how easy it is for someone to slip inside the blind spots of your life, to become a shadow that moves when you're not looking. I know this sounds like something out of a movie, but it happened exactly this way, and I'm curious. If you've ever discovered that your home wasn't as empty as you thought, or found something hidden in a place you were supposed to feel safe, would you share it in the comments? I have a feeling there are more stories like this out there than most of us want to admit. Story 3. I bought my first house when I was 28. A small, slightly crooked place clinging to the side of a hill in a little Appalachian town in western North Carolina. The kind of place where the mountains lean in close and the trains sound farther away than they actually are. I had spent my whole life, up until then, crammed in with other people. Parents, siblings, roommates, paper-thin apartment walls, and there was a part of me that had started to believe real quiet was something other people exaggerated. The house wasn't anything special on paper. 2 bedrooms, warped hardwood floors, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s, and a tiny second-story porch just big enough to stand on. But when I stood there during the showing, looking out over the drop to the backyard below and across to the row of houses that backed up against mine along the slope, I felt something unlock in my chest. I could see the treetops in the distance, ridge lines layered like faded blue paper, and for the first time in a long time I let myself believe I might finally have a place that was actually mine. The strangest adjustment, moving from a home full of people to living alone on that hillside, was the silence. At night, when I turned off the TV, there were moments when the only sounds were the faint ticking of my old ceiling fan and the soft whoosh of trucks on the highway far below. No one slamming bathrooms, doors, no footsteps overhead, no muffled arguments through the wall. It was peaceful in a way that made my chest ache and unsettling in a way I hadn't expected. I started a little ritual to cope with it. Every night after work, I would step out onto that tiny porch next to my bedroom, light a cigarette, and let the cold air and nicotine smooth out the edges of the day. The porch wasn't really a balcony in the glamorous sense. It was basically a shallow concrete slab with a wobbly railing, and just enough room for me to stand and lean my forearms on the metal. From there, I could look straight down into my own backyard and, over the drop and chain link fence at the back of the property, into the yard of the house sitting directly below mine on the slope. The way the lots were stacked along the hillside meant that our backyards almost overlapped. If it weren't for the fences and the steep drop, you could have passed things back and forth between the 2 houses like neighbors across a kitchen table. It didn't take long for me to meet most of the people on my street, retirees who'd been there for decades, a young couple with a baby, a guy my age who worked nights at the sawmill. They waved when I pulled into the driveway, brought over casseroles when I first moved in, told me which part of the highway to avoid in the snow. The one exception was the house below mine. I never saw anyone in that yard. The grass there grew higher than everyone else's, scattered with last year's leaves and a couple of rusted lawn chairs. The paint on the siding had peeled and bubbled, and one corner of the roofline sagged a little, giving the place a tired, slouched look. Once, I saw a dim light in one of the back windows late at night, but it went out before I could really focus on it. Weeks went by, and I still hadn't met whoever lived there. Sometimes, when I leaned on the railing after work with a cigarette, I'd find myself watching their yard and wondering if they watched mine. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One Saturday, I decided I should introduce myself and at least put a face to the place I'd been staring at. I walked down the hill, followed the narrow road that wound around to the front side of the lower houses, and found the address that matched the lot behind mine. Up close, the place looked worse. The front porch boards were grayed and warped, the railing loose. A mountain of junk mail and circulars was stuffed into a rusted mailbox nailed crookedly to a post. Weeds choked the walkway, pushing up between cracked concrete slabs. It felt less like visiting a neighbor and more like walking toward a building that had been forgotten. The doorbell button was missing, leaving only a little dark hole in the metal plate. I knocked instead, 3 loud, polite knocks, and stepped back, feeling oddly self-conscious on that sagging porch. Nothing. No footsteps. No sound from inside. I waited another minute, then raised my hand to knock again. Just as my knuckles touched the wood, I caught the slightest movement in the front window to my left, behind a crooked blind. It was so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been already on edge. The quick, jerky shift of a shadow, the glint of an eye-catching light. I realized I was being watched. A heavy discomfort settled in my stomach. I turned to leave, deciding that whoever lived there probably didn't want visitors, when the front door flew open behind me with such force that it bounced off the wall and rattled the loose glass in its frame. I spun back around, heart thudding, and found myself face to face with an older woman filling the doorway. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with thin gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her lined face. Her skin was pale and the hollows under her eyes were dark. But what struck me first and hardest were those eyes themselves, wide, unblinking, locked on me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. There was something taut about her entire expression, like every muscle from her jaw to her forehead had been pulled just a little too tight and then frozen that way. For a beat, we just stared at each other. The air between us felt thick and cold, as if I had opened a freezer by mistake. I managed to introduce myself, stumbling over my own name as I explained that Id just moved into the house behind hers and wanted to say hello. She didn't react at first, just kept staring. And then, after an uncomfortably long pause, she said in a flat, almost toneless voice that she was called Mrs. Carver. No smile, no polite questions back, just that name and that stare, as if she was waiting for me to say something else that might incriminate me. I mumbled something about not wanting to bother her, wished her a good day, and backed down the steps, feeling the weight of her gaze on my back the entire time. I never heard the door close behind me, and I didn't turn around to check. That evening, I tried to shake the encounter off as just another awkward moment with a reclusive neighbor. People live strange, private lives in these mountains. That's practically a cliché. I went through my new routine shower, leftover dinner, a little TV before stepping out onto the bedroom porch with a cigarette. The air had that damp chill that settles in valleys after sunset, and the sky was dark enough that the ridges across from me were just massive shapes against a slightly lighter patch of night. I took a drag, exhaled, and glanced down into the yard below. She was there, standing dead center in the patchy grass of her backyard, directly beneath my line of sight, was Mrs. Carver. She wasn't gardening or taking out trash or doing anything that could be interpreted as normal. She was just standing perfectly still, head tilted slightly back, looking straight up at my porch. The porch light was behind me, so I doubted she could see my face clearly, but I could see hers. That same wide-eyed, fixed expression, like she was staring through me instead of at me. Something about the position of her body, the way her arms hung at her sides, made the scene feel wrong, like a photograph where the subject wasn't expecting to be caught. I froze, cigarette halfway to my mouth. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My brain scrambled to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe she heard me come out and just happened to look up. Maybe she was checking something on her siding and I caught her at a weird time, but those rationalizations felt thin and brittle. Eventually, I stubbed the cigarette out in the ashtray and went back inside, telling myself that staring back would only feed whatever was going on. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued in different ways. Some evenings, when I stepped out to smoke, I would catch a flicker of movement through her windows as she moved from room to room, that pale face appearing in one frame, then another, always turned toward my house. Twice, I turned off the porch light before stepping out, thinking maybe the darkness would help me feel less exposed, and both times I saw the faint glow of a flashlight or candle move behind her curtains, tracking the rough direction of where I was standing. I tried not to make eye contact, tried to pretend I didn't notice, but it's hard to ignore the sensation of being watched when you know exactly where the eyes are. One morning, about a week into this routine, I stepped outside to leave for work and noticed something on the concrete of my tiny front stoop. At first, I thought it was just wind-blown trash. But when I bent down, my stomach clenched. It was a small, folded square of paper held in place by 3 of my cigarette butts, arranged in a neat triangle. I always used an ashtray on the upstairs porch and emptied it into the trash. I never tossed them over the railing. My hands felt clumsy as I brushed the butts aside and opened the paper. There were only 4 words written there, in small, shaky handwriting. "You smell like him." I stared at the note for a long time. Adrenaline buzzing, the morning air suddenly feeling too thin. I threw it away and told myself, it'd overreact if I called the police over a creepy note and some staring. After all, nothing technically criminal had happened yet. Instead, I called my dad on the drive to work and told him a sanitized version of what had been going on. He lives a few states away and has a practical, no-nonsense way of looking at the world that I sometimes lean on more than I admit. He listened and then said what I already half expected. She probably had dementia or some other mental illness, and I should feel sorry for her more than anything. In a town like that, he reminded me, family doesn't always step up, and people fall through the cracks. It was hard to argue with that, and harder still to admit that empathy didn't actually make me feel any less uneasy. A few nights passed without anything new. When I stepped out on the porch, her yard was empty, no pale face at the window. I caught myself scanning each window anyway, like a habit I couldn't shake. For a couple days, I even allowed myself to believe that maybe Shed lost interest in watching me, that maybe my dad was right and the strange behavior had just been a passing episode. Then, one Saturday morning, I walked out back to drag my trash can up to the curb and stopped short. Right against the inside of my chain-link fence, near the bottom of the slope where my yard met hers, lay a single worn-out men's work boot. It was caked in dried mud, the laces stiff, the leather cracked. Next to it, hanging on my side of the fence by one of its stretched-out ribs, was a woman's sock thin, discolored, and damp from the dew. They were positioned in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had placed them there rather than tossed them. The sock in particular made my scalp prickle. It was on my side of the fence, which meant someone had reached over or climbed halfway up the slope to leave it there. I stood for a minute just staring at the objects, the morning quiet around me suddenly feeling like a held breath. I told myself a dozen reasonable stories. Maybe the items had washed downhill during a storm, maybe a stray dog had carried them, maybe kids from farther up the road had been messing around. None of those explanations fit cleanly, and yet I did nothing except toss them into my outside trash bin and go back inside, angry at myself for being rattled, and even more angry that I didn't want to be the new guy calling the cops about everything. That night, lying in bed with the window cracked open for air, I heard a sound that I can still replay in perfect detail. It started as a faint, irregular scrape, like something rough sliding slowly against wood. It took my half-asleep brain a few seconds to identify where it was coming from. The exterior wall just below my bedroom window, the one that faced the drop-down to the backyard, and beyond it, hers. For a moment I froze, every muscle locked, listening. The scraping continued, a slow, deliberate drag that moved along the wall, stopped, then started again. It was not the sound of tree branches. There were no branches close enough to touch the siding. It wasn't an animal scratching either. There was a patience to it, a rhythm, like someone trailing the edge of something metal, maybe along the house as they walked. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might shake the bed frame. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept to the window, staying low. The scraping stopped. I held my breath and, after a moment, lifted one corner of the blind just enough to see out. From that angle, I couldn't see directly below my window, just the yard dropping away and the dark rectangle of her house beyond. One of her upstairs windows glowed with a low yellow light. As I watched, that light moved, as if someone carrying a lamp or flashlight crossed the room, and for a split second a thin, distorted shadow stretched tall across the inside of the curtain. Long fingers splayed. The image was gone, almost as soon as I registered it. I let the blind fall back into place and backed away, forcing myself not to imagine what or who might have been standing just beneath my window, close enough to touch the siding. The next day, I walked the perimeter of my house in broad daylight. On the section of siding below my bedroom, I found a faint, jagged line of scuffs about chest high, as if something sharp had been dragged along the paint. Not deep enough to gouge, but fresh enough that the dust had a different texture there when I brushed my fingers across it. I felt a flash of anger then, hot and sharp. Someone was crossing physical boundaries now. I promised myself that if anything else happened, I'd call the police. Neighbor politics be damned. It didn't take long. A few nights later, I had just fallen into a restless sleep when the doorbell started ringing. Not a single normal ring, not even a couple of impatient jabs, but an insistent, rapid-fire chiming over and over, like a child pounding on a toy or someone trying to break the button. My eyes flew open, and for a half-second that sound didn't make sense to me in the context of my dark bedroom on a quiet mountain street. Then I realized what it was, and every nerve in my body lit up. The ringing went on without stopping. 12, 15 times. I lost count. In that moment, I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't picturing worst-case scenarios or carefully weighing my options. I was just exhausted and irritated and done. My main thought was that I couldn't let this pattern, whatever it was, continue. I threw on a t-shirt, grabbed my phone, and headed for the front door, rehearsing in my head a stern but calm speech about boundaries and calling the sheriff if this didn't stop. The ringing ceased, just as my hand closed on the knob. The sudden silence felt almost as loud. I took a breath to steady myself, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. Everything that happened next compressed into a blur that only untangles when I force myself to slow it down. The porch light was on, casting a sharp circle of white onto the small landing and a slice of the yard beyond. Mrs. Carver was standing just inside that ring of light, closer than I expected, head angled down slightly. For a fraction of a second, she was still. Then, with a speed I would not have thought possible for someone her age, she lunged forward. In her right hand, glinting under the porch bulb, was a kitchen knife. Her face, twisted now with rage, was barely recognizable as the unreadable mask I'd seen before. Her mouth was wide open, but at first I couldn't process the words pouring out of it. There was something about how I'd taken her son from her, how I smelled like someone who had hurt him, how she knew I was pretending not to remember. It was like being hit by a wave of pure, unfocused grief and anger. Instinct took over. I grabbed her wrist with both hands, feeling the tendons and bones under her thin skin, and wrenched it sideways, trying to both keep the knife away from my body and avoid hurting her more than necessary. She was lighter than me, but strong in a wild, desperate way that made the struggle feel endless. We crashed against the door frame, both of us half inside, half outside the house. At some point, the knife slipped from her fingers and clattered across the floor. I kicked it away and managed to pin her arms to her sides, lowering us both to the ground. She didn't stop. She thrashed and writhed under my grip, still screaming about her son, promising she would kill me, her spittle hitting my face, her eyes rolling and wild. At one point, she snapped her head forward and tried to bite my forearm. I jerked back just in time, my heart thundering in my ears. Time blurred. My muscles burned from holding her down, but I didn't dare loosen my grip. I remember fumbling my phone out of my pocket with one hand, hitting the emergency call button with a clumsy thumb, and shouting my address into the receiver over her screams. The dispatcher's questions were a distant hum compared to the raw sound coming from the woman underneath me. Those minutes waiting for the police were some of the longest of my life. When the cruiser finally pulled up, its headlights splashing across the front of my house, the sound of tires on gravel felt like a lifeline. The officers moved fast, pulling me back and restraining her with practiced efficiency. Even as they cuffed her, she kept shouting, her voice hoarse. Up close, in the harsh flash of their lights, I could see the broken threads of her life etched into every line of her face. There was nothing supernatural about her, no curse, no demon, just a deeply broken human being whose mind had wrapped itself around some trauma and refused to let go. Afterward, when the house was finally quiet and I was left alone with a cup of water and a generic statement about charges and psychiatric evaluations, I walked back through the rooms, turning off lights and checking locks with a kind of shaky ritual. Near my bedroom door, on the inside knob, I noticed a faint reddish smear I hadn't seen before. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it was blood. I stepped closer, chest tight, and realized it was rust. The flurry at the door when Shed lunged must have scraped some old metal against the paint and left a mark. It shouldn't have mattered, but for some reason that detail lodged itself in my mind as the perfect metaphor for all of it. Something ugly and alarming that was, in the end, just decay, just neglect, built up over years and finally brought to the surface. I ended up moving out less than a year later. On paper, my reasons were practical, job opportunity, better commute, closer to family, but beneath all of that was the fact that the house never felt the same. Every creak, every shadow under a streetlight, every ring of the doorbell, even in my new place, sent a jolt through me that I couldn't fully explain. I still think about Mrs. Carver more often than I'd like to admit. I don't excuse what she did, but I can't fully demonize her either. She needed help long before I ever showed up on that hillside. And the system, like it does for so many people, just didn't catch her in time. What stuck with me most, though, wasn't her knife or her screaming. It was the slow build before that, the nights on the porch feeling eyes on me, the note on my step, the scrape along the siding when I was half asleep and pretending it was nothing. It made me realize how vulnerable we all really are in the places we call home, how thin the line can be between feeling safe and feeling hunted. I know this story sounds like something you'd hear in a late-night podcast, but it happened, and it still colors the way I relate to neighbors and strangers both. If you've ever had a neighbor who made your skin crawl, or an experience that changed the way you feel inside your own home, I'd honestly like to hear it. Drop it in the comments if you're comfortable sharing. It's strange how much lighter these memories can feel when you realize you're not the only one who's lived through something like this.